But fate had other plans for him. Every dollar was a reminder of what he lost. He was running out of time. 11 years. Gone in 11 seconds. He shook the hand of the man who destroyed him. She saw cinnamon rolls in a building nobody wanted. He saw something else bad. A way out. 50 failed loaves. One inheritance he swore he'd never touch. And a promise he refused to break. 14 months later, karma didn't knock. It walked right through the front door.
If you have ever been told you are not good enough, stay until the end of this video, because what happened to Daniel Reyes will remind you that the people who throw you away are sometimes the same people who end up needing you the most. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we tell these kinds of stories every single week, and you will not want to miss the next one. Now, let's begin. Daniel Reyes had exactly $14.37 in his checking account the Zobing. Morning, his daughter asked him if Santa was going to be able to find their new address. It was the second week of December, and they were living in a motel off Route 9. The kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and a vending machine that ate your last dollar without giving you anything back. 6 months earlier, Daniel had been a senior operations manager at Halbrook Consumer Goods, a mid-sized company that made kitchen appliances and prided itself on its family culture in every recruitment brochure. He had worked there for 11 years. He had missed his own wedding anniversary twice because of quarterly closings. He had trained 4 new regional directors who went on to make more money than him. And on a Tuesday in June, he was called into a glass-walled conference room and told, in the gentlest corporate language money could buy, that his position was being restructured out of existence, effective immediately. The man who delivered the news was named Marcus Whitfield. Marcus was 38 years old, wore a watch that cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, and had been installed as the new CEO only 4 months earlier after a private equity firm bought a controlling stake in Halbrook. Marcus talked about synergy and lean structures the way other men talked about sports. He did not know that Daniel had a 7-year-old daughter named Mia, or that Daniel's wife had passed away 3 years earlier from an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer, leaving Daniel as her only parent. He did not know, and if he had known, it likely would not have changed anything, because to Marcus, employees were line items, and Daniel's line item needed to disappear so that the numbers on a slide in a shareholder meeting would look better for exactly 1 quarter. Daniel did not yell. He did not beg. He shook Marcus's hand because his mother had raised him to always be the bigger man, walked to his car, sat behind the wheel in the parking garage, and cried for 11 minutes before he trusted himself enough to drive home and figure out how he was going to tell his daughter that everything was about to change. What followed was the kind of slow unraveling that people who have never lived paycheck to paycheck cannot fully understand. Severance ran out faster than anyone budgets for. Interviews turned into polite rejections, then into silence. Landlords do not wait for opportunity to knock twice, and by September, Daniel and Mia were evicted from the apartment they had lived in. Since Mia was a toddler, they moved into his sister's cramped 1-bedroom for 6 weeks until her lease made that impossible, and then into the motel, where Daniel worked 2 part-time jobs stocking shelves overnight at a grocery store and delivering food on a bicycle he had bought second-hand for $40, sometimes riding through freezing rain because a canceled shift meant a missed meal. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being poor and proud at the same time. Daniel never once let Mia see him break. He learned to laugh at their motel room's broken heater by calling it our own personal igloo adventure. He learned to make dollar store spaghetti taste like a special occasion by lighting a bowl half-melted candle on the nightstand and calling it fancy restaurant night. But behind that performance, something in him was breaking in a way he could not repair with jokes. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, drizzling day that makes a small town feel even smaller. Daniel had walked Mia 3 blocks out of their way after school because she loved looking in the yurge window of an old, boarded-up building on Chestnut Street that used to be a bakery. Its faded sign, half peeled from years of weather, still read, Higgins and Daughter Bakery, Este, 1974. Mia pressed her face against the dusty glass and said, "Daddy, I bet it smelled like cinnamon in there." Daniel looked at his daughters, face lit up with an imagination that poverty had not managed to steal from her yet, and something inside him quietly decided that he was done surviving. He wanted to build something. That night, back in the motel room, Daniel lay awake on the thin mattress, listening to Mia's steady breathing in the bed beside him, and he thought about all the versions of his life that had quietly closed on him over the past 6 months. The version where he was a respected operations manager with a corner desk near the window. The version where he and his wife had promised each other a small house with a garden once the kids were older, a promise that cancer had cut short before they ever got to keep it. The version where Mia grew up in one stable home instead of counting how many towels the motel let them keep for free. Grief, Daniel had learned, does not always arrive as a single wave. Sometimes it arrives as a slow tide that keeps taking a little more of the shore every single day, until you look up and realize how much ground you're already lost without noticing the moment it happened. But that night, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion finally breaking something open in him, or maybe it was simply his daughter's face pressed against dusty glass, imagining cinnamon smells in a building that had been empty for years. Either way, Daniel found himself doing something he hadn't done in months. He started making a list. Not a list of expenses, not a list of bills he couldn't pay, but a list of things he actually knew how to do. He was good with his hands. He had learned discipline the hard way, first from 11 years of corporate deadlines, then from 2 exhausting part-time jobs that had nearly broken his back and his spirit both. He was patient in a way that running a household with a grieving, growing daughter had forced him to become. And he had, buried somewhere under all the fear, an old memory of standing beside his own mother as a boy, watching her bake bread on Sunday mornings before church. The whole kitchen filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. It should have been an impossible dream. Daniel had no money, no credit, and a resume with an 11-year gap forming right in the middle of it, thanks to unemployment. But what Daniel did have was a grandmother who, before she passed away years earlier, had left him a small inheritance tied up in an old trust that he had never wanted to touch because it felt like taking money meant for something more important than rent. He had always imagined that money would go toward Mia's college fund, but sitting outside that boarded-up bakery, watching his daughter dream about cinnamon smells that did not exist yet, Daniel understood, with a clarity he had not felt in years, exactly what that money was for. He met with the trust's estate lawyer the next morning. The inheritance was modest by most standards, just under $62,000, but it was enough. Enough for a down payment on the building, enough for basic renovations, enough for a second-hand oven and a walk-in cooler that made a strange humming noise, but worked. Daniel spent every waking hour that wasn't devoted to Mia learning everything he could about baking. He watched hundreds of videos. He begged a retired baker 2 towns over to let him volunteer unpaid in her kitchen just to learn the fundamentals of dough, of proofing, of the exact moment butter and sugar create something more than the sum of their parts. He failed spectacularly at first. His first 50 loaves of bread were dense enough to use as doorstops. His croissants collapsed into sad, buttery puddles. But Daniel had spent 11 years in a corporate job absorbing pain silently, and he discovered that failing at bread, out loud, in a kitchen that was his own, felt like freedom instead of shame. By February, 7 weeks after the first day he ever touched an oven that belonged to him, Daniel reopened Higgins and Daughter under a new name, Mia's Morning. He kept the original brick facade, sanded down the original wooden counter that had somehow survived a decade of dust, and hung a small hand-painted sign above the register that read, "Made by a dad who refused to quit." Mia, now 8, insisted on designing the logo herself. It was a crooked little drawing of a cinnamon roll with a smiling face, and Daniel had it printed exactly as she drew it, imperfections and all, onto every paper bag the shop used. The first 3 months were brutal. Daniel worked 18-hour days. He baked at 4 in the morning, opened the shop at 6, closed at 4 in the afternoon so he could pick Mia up from school, did her homework with her at the shop's back table, while dough rose in the walk-in, then went home and did prep for the next day until midnight. Some days he sold nothing but a handful of coffees. Some days he threw away more bread than he sold. There were nights he sat in the dark kitchen and wondered if he had made the most reckless decision of his life, gambling away Mia's future for a dream built on cinnamon and stubbornness. But slowly, painfully, the shop began to breathe. A local blogger wrote about the bakery's cardamom buns, calling them the best thing that has happened to Chestnut Street in a decade. A regular customer, an elderly widower named Harold, who came in every single morning for a black coffee and a slice of sourdough, started bringing his entire senior center walking group along with him. Word of mouth, that oldest and most stubborn form of marketing, began doing what advertising budgets could not. By the 6-month mark, Mia's morning had a line out the door on weekend mornings. By the 10-month mark, Daniel had hired his first 2 employees, a culinary school dropout named Priya, who had more raw talent than half the professional chefs Daniel had ever met, and a quiet teenager named Julio, who was saving up to help his mother pay off medical debt. Daniel understood exactly what that kind of weight felt like, and he paid Julio more than minimum wage without being asked. By the time the bakery's first anniversary rolled around, Daniel had done something that felt, to him, more impossible than any bread recipe. He had rebuilt a life. He and Mia had moved out of the motel and into a small 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, nothing fancy but theirs, with a working heater and a kitchen where Mia was learning to crack eggs without leaving shell fragments behind. Daniel still worked exhausting hours, but for the first time since Marcus Whitfield shook his hand in that glass conference room, Daniel Reyes felt like a man who was building instead of merely enduring. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning, 14 months after Mia's morning first opened its doors, that the bell above the shop's entrance rang and Marcus Whitfield walked in. He looked different, thinner, grayer at the temples, wearing a coat that was expensive but slightly wrinkled, as though he had slept in his car or a cheap hotel. He did not immediately recognize Daniel, who was behind the counter in a flour-dusted apron, sleeves rolled up, pulling a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven. Marcus ordered a black coffee in a voice that had lost some of its old, easy confidence, the voice, walk of a man who used to walk into rooms assuming he owned them, and had since learned that rooms can, and do, take that assumption away. It was only when Daniel turned around to hand him the coffee that recognition hit them both at the same moment. Marcus's face went through a fast, visible sequence of emotions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. "Daniel," Marcus said, and it came out quieter than he probably intended. "Daniel Reyes." "Marcus," Daniel replied, and he did not smile, but he did not scowl either. He simply set the coffee down on the counter with the same steady hands he used for everything else in this shop. There was a long, awkward silence, the kind that fills a small bakery in a way it never fills a glass-walled boardroom. Marcus looked around at the shop, at the mismatched vintage chairs Daniel had found at estate sales, at the crooked cinnamon roll logo Mia had drawn stamped onto every napkin, at the small chalkboard sign that read, "Today's Special, Cardamom Buns, made fresh at 6 a.m. by hands that don't quit." Marcus read that sign twice. "You own this place," Marcus said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," Daniel said. 14 months now. Marcus looked down at his coffee like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the low. Halbrook filed for restructuring bankruptcy 8 months ago," he said, quietly, almost as if confessing something. "The private equity group that installed me pulled out once the debt-to-earnings ratios didn't hit their projections fast enough. They blamed me, replaced me, and the board that replaced me sold off most of the divisions for parts. I haven't worked in 7 months." Daniel did not gloat. There was a version of this moment he had imagined more than once over the past year and a half. A version where he got to say something sharp and satisfying, something that balanced the scales after the humiliation of being let go, with less warning than a change in weather. But standing there, looking at a man who looked tired and diminished in the same way Daniel himself had looked 18 months earlier, None of those sharp words came. Instead, what came out was simpler. "I'm sorry to hear that," Daniel said, and he meant it, which surprised him more than it surprised Marcus. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're sorry. I fired you with 2 sentences and a handshake, and you're sorry for me." "Being let go from Halbrook was the worst day of my life," Daniel said honestly, "for about 6 months. Then it turned into the reason I finally built something that was actually mine." He gestured around the small shop, at Priya calling out an order to Julio, at 2 elderly women laughing over lattes near the window, at Mia's drawing framed proudly by the register. "I'm not going to pretend I'm grateful you fired me. I'm not. It nearly destroyed my daughter and me. But I stopped being angry about it around the time I realized the anger wasn't hurting you. It was only hurting me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the window. Finally, he asked, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the old executive polish, "How did you do it?" "Rebuild, I mean. From nothing." And so Daniel told him, not the polished LinkedIn version of the story, but the real one, the motel, the vending machine that stole his last dollar, Mia asking if Santa could find their new address, the trust from his grandmother that he almost didn't touch, the 50 ruined loaves of bread, the 18-hour days, the nights he wasn't sure he'd made the right choice. He told Marcus about hiring Priya, because talent deserved a chance, even without a fancy diploma, and about paying Julio more than minimum wage, because Daniel understood exactly what it felt like to be quietly drowning in bills nobody else could see. Marcus listened the entire time without interrupting, which was, in itself, a kind of change in him. The old Marcus interrupted everyone. This Marcus just listened, nodding slowly, his coffee going cold in his hands. "I don't know how to ask you this without it sounding insulting," Marcus finally said, "but would you consider letting me work here? Anything. Dishes, deliveries, cleaning the ovens. I have almost nothing left in savings. And every corporate recruiter treats a failed CEO stint like a warning label. I understand if the answer is no. God knows I wouldn't blame you." Daniel studied him for a long moment. He thought about every version of justice he had imagined over the past year and a half, and how none of the satisfying speeches he had rehearsed in the shower actually mattered anymore. He thought about the exhausted, humbled man standing across the counter from him, and about the fact that pain, wherever it lands, rarely asks first whether the person deserves it. "I'll give you a trial shift," Daniel said. 6 a.m. tomorrow. You're on dish duty and flour deliveries. If you show up late, or if you talk to my staff the way corporate people used to talk to me, you're done. Understood? Marcus nodded, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, something like relief crossed his face. Understood. Thank you, Daniel. I mean that. The next morning, at exactly 5:58 a.m., Marcus Whitfield showed up in old jeans and a borrowed apron. And for the first time in his professional life, he washed dishes until his hands cracked from the hot water and mild soap, hauled 50-pound bags of flour up a narrow back staircase, and took instructions from a man he had once fired with a 2-sentence corporate script. He did not complain. He did not once mention his old title. By the end of the first week, Priya had taught him how to properly fold dough without deflating it, and Julio, 16 years old and unimpressed by titles of any kind, had started calling him Flour Guy, as an affectionate nickname that Marcus, to everyone's mild surprise, seemed to genuinely enjoy. Word got around town, as it always does in a place small enough for gossip to travel faster than delivery trucks. People started coming into Mia's morning specifically to see the corporate guy who fired his own baker and now works for him. Daniel found the attention faintly uncomfortable at first, worried it made the shop feel like a spectacle instead of a business. But then a local news reporter named Sandra Kim came in one afternoon, ordered a cardamom bun, and asked if she could interview both of them for a short human interest piece on the town's Toon Community News segment. Daniel almost said no. He did not want Mia's morning to become a headline about revenge or irony. But Marcus, standing beside him with flour still dusted on his forearms, said something that changed Daniel's mind. "Let her tell it," Marcus said. "Not as some story about a corporate villain getting humbled. Tell it as what it actually is. A story about a man who lost everything twice, in two different ways, and chose to build something instead of staying bitter both times. The segment aired on a Sunday evening news broadcast 3 weeks later. It was 4 minutes long, simple and unpolished, filmed mostly in the bakery's kitchen, with flour still on the counters. Sandra Kim's narration told the story honestly, how Daniel had been let go without warning after 11 loyal years, how he had lost his housing, how he had used his late grandmother's trust to open a small bakery named after his daughter, and how, 14 months later, the very executive who had fired him walked back through the door needing a job himself. The segment ended with a shot of Daniel and Marcus laughing together over a tray of burnt croissants that Marcus had accidentally left in the oven 2 minutes too long, and Mia, now the store's self-appointed quality control officer, sternly informing both grown men that burnt croissants do not pass inspection. The video, uploaded to the news station's online platform, did something none of them expected. It went viral, not in the loud, aggressive way corporate scandals usually go viral, but in the quiet, word-of-mouth way that genuinely moving stories spread. Within a week, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. People left comments not about Marcus's downfall, but about Daniel's resilience, about a father who turned a motel room and $14 into a business that fed an entire town. Orders started coming in from people 2 counties away who had seen the segment and wanted to support the dad who refused to quit. A regional bakery supply distributor reached out, offering better wholesale rates once they saw the shop's sudden growth in foot traffic. A local credit union, moved by the story, approached Daniel about a small business loan to help him expand into the empty storefront next door, something Daniel had daydreamed about, but never seriously believed he could afford. 6 weeks after the segment aired, Mia's morning expanded into the adjoining space, adding a proper seating area, a display case triple the original size, and a small dedicated corner for what Daniel called the community table, a long wooden table where anyone who couldn't afford a full meal that day could eat for free. No questions asked, funded quietly by a portion of every sale. Daniel remembered too well what it felt like to skip a meal so his daughter could eat, and he never wanted anyone in his town to sit in a motel room doing that kind of math again if he could help it. Marcus, for his part, slowly transitioned from dish duty into something closer to an operations role, though he insisted, almost stubbornly, on never taking a title grander than assistant. He handled supplier negotiations, streamlined the shop's ordering process using skills that, ironically, were the exact corporate instincts that had once made him dangerous in a boardroom and now made him quietly useful in a kitchen. But this time, those instincts were pointed toward keeping a small, kind business alive instead of squeezing efficiency out of people's livelihoods. He never asked for the title of manager, and Daniel never offered it, not out of cruelty, but because both men seemed to understand, without ever discussing it directly, that this new arrangement worked precisely because neither of them was chasing power anymore. One evening, almost a year after Marcus had first walked back through that door, the 2 men were closing up the shop together, wiping down the same wooden counter that had survived since 1974. Marcus, scrubbing a stubborn patch of dried dough off the countertop, finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting with him for months. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped outside this building with Mia that day, if she hadn't wanted to look through that window? Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things now, without the old bitterness that used to color every memory of that period of his life. I think about it sometimes, he admitted, but I also think the window wasn't really the important part. Mia was the important part. She looked at a boarded-up, forgotten building and saw cinnamon rolls instead of dust. Kids do that. They see what things could be instead of what they currently are. I think losing my job was terrible, and I'll never pretend otherwise. But it forced me to finally listen to that same instinct in myself, the one that got buried under 11 years of quarterly reports and performance reviews. Marcus nodded slowly, still scrubbing at the counter. I used to think success meant never needing anyone. I built an entire career out of that idea. cutting costs, cutting people, always moving up, and never looking sideways at who got left behind. It took losing everything for me to understand that the version of success I was chasing was actually just isolation with a bigger paycheck. Daniel smiled at that, a real, unguarded smile. Well, flower guy, welcome to the version of success that actually feeds people. Marcus laughed, properly, for what might have been the first time since he'd walked back through that door over a year earlier. It's a good version, he said. I'm glad I found it, even if I had to lose my old career, my savings, and most of my pride to get here. Outside, Chestnut Street was quiet under early evening light, the kind of golden, forgiving light that makes even an old weathered street look like it's full of promise. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread still lingered in the air, the same smell that an 8-year-old girl had once imagined behind a dusty, boarded-up window, back when her father had nothing but $14, an idea, and a stubborn refusal to let his daughter's Christmas go unanswered. Today, Mia's morning employs 11 people. It runs 2 community tables now, one in the original town location and a second in a newly opened branch 2 towns over, both funded by the same simple promise Daniel made to himself in that dark motel room. Nobody eats their pain alone, if he can help it. Priya, once a culinary school dropout nobody else wanted to hire, now runs the entire pastry program and is developing her own signature line of seasonal treats. Julio finished paying off his mother's medical debt 18 months ago and is now saving for culinary school himself. Tuition, partially covered by a scholarship fund, Daniel quietly set up, using a portion of the shop's, Ev's profits. Marcus still works there, still answers to Flower Guy with something that looks suspiciously like pride, and has never once asked to be called anything more important. And Mia, now 10 years old, still draws the logo for every new product the shop releases, crooked lines and all, because her father believes, with his whole heart, that some imperfections are worth keeping exactly as they are. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this. The people who discard you rarely get the final say in your story. Titles disappear. Companies restructure. Bank accounts empty out faster than anyone plans for. But the thing inside a person that refuses to quit, the thing that looks at a boarded-up, forgotten building and still sees cinnamon rolls waiting to happen, that thing cannot be fired, laid off, or restructured out of existence. It can only be built on, one imperfect loaf at a time. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If Daniel and Mia's journey moved you even a little, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we have so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to let their worst day become their whole story. We'll see you in the next one.